Hello. This will be the fourth and final video lecture about the topic of social movements. I'll be talking about the history of the Black Panther Party and the more recent history of Black Lives Matter. As with the other lectures, I'll be mixing some historical examples with more present day ones. So I'm going to go to the screen share and pull up PowerPoint. So, as with the other lectures about the labor movement and about the anti-globalization movement and Occupy Wall Street, we're using this definition of social movements as forms of collective action and protest for equality that create political possibilities for social reform and justice. We're talking about social movements as organizations that represent change from the bottom up. So more democratic, grassroots, and participatory kinds of movements that, quote, are organizational structures and strategies that may empower oppressed populations to mount effective challenges and resist the more powerful and advantaged elites. So with the Black Panther Party, they basically start in Oakland in 1966. These two guys who are pictured here, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, they were both college students at the time in Oakland at Merritt College. And the initial purpose of the Black Panther Party was basically to patrol the Black neighborhoods in Oakland and look to see when police had pulled somebody over or were doing something. And the Black Panthers would basically protect people, residents, from police brutality. There had been a number of violent incidents, including people being killed by the police in Oakland. And so the Black Panthers basically started as a small group for armed self-defense. You see that self-defense was actually in the original name of the group, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And that was basically in response to things that had been going on in Oakland with the police. Eventually, the party would quickly expand as the late 60s went on. And as they expanded, they also expanded the social programs and various things that they would do in the community. So this included things like free breakfast for children. It included all kinds of different educational programs. And it also included a lot of health programs, community health clinics and testing and this sort of thing. So as the 1960s went on, Black Panthers became not just about self-defense from the police, but also about serving their communities in various urban neighborhoods across the United States. So to understand the Panthers and their, how they came about, you have to sort of situate them within the changes that were going on in Oakland in the period after World War II, and sort of the situation of the Black community that was growing within Oakland in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. So during World War II, tens of thousands of Black people had left the southern states in what is known as the Second Great Migration. And they were moving to Oakland and other Bay Area cities to find work in the war industries, such as Kaiser shipyards. So this is the second migration. The first Great Migration is generally periodized as taking place around and shortly after World War I, so like in the late 19 teens and early 1920s. and that's generally associated with migration to cities like Chicago, where Black people were living, in the southern states previously. There's this kind of mass migration towards the cities, especially more like in the north. And the main lure for that is jobs in the defense industries and jobs in that are basically created by the mobilization for war. So the second migration coincides with the Second World War. And here we see more of a migration to like the Western cities like Oakland and Los Angeles. And again, the attraction, the lure is jobs that are being created by the mobilization for war. And so a new generation of young Black people growing up in these cities faced new forms of poverty and racism. In particular, the Black Panther Party membership, quote, consisted of recent migrants whose families traveled north and west to escape the Southern racial regime, only to be confronted with new forms of segregation and repression. So you have to understand the whole promise of both the first and the second Great Migration was that people could leave the repression and violence and racism of the South and start a new life, like in California. And, the hope was that there would be more opportunity and things would be better and things would be less racist. And then they come, to Oakland and Los Angeles and these places only to find that there are these very comparable systems of institutionalized racism in housing and education and healthcare, and that there are these racist police forces that are enacting violence on the Black communities on a daily basis. And so there's this real sense of frustration because of the dashed promises of what like a new life in California might look like. So, as in many cities, many other cities, Oakland's Black population was concentrated in poor urban ghettos, like in West Oakland, that had high unemployment and substandard housing, and was also mostly excluded from political representation from the top universities and from the middle class. So this goes back to our earlier lectures where we talked about the racial wealth gap and the growth of the suburbs, the way in which the growth of suburbs was subsidized by the U.S. government, the way in which it contributed to a kind of de facto segregation in terms of the divide between the cities and the suburbs, and the ways in which the cities were left in basically a condition of benign neglect, where there was sort of disinvestment and a sort of economic downward spiral, at the same time that other parts of the country, particularly the suburbs, were booming. So you have this kind of deterioration and disinvestment that's taking place within the inner cities, in the 1960s. So that sort of goes back to that earlier lecture on housing and the racial wealth gap. So the Black Panthers, as I mentioned, start in late 1966 with this campaign to basically they're going to arm themselves and follow the police cars around the Oakland neighborhoods. And if there's an incident, if they pull somebody over or something, the Panthers would get out of the car. They had like tape machines, to record. And they had also studied the law. And so they would get out also with their big shotguns because that was legal in California at that time. And so they would basically go out and kind of like, watch the cops and intervene if something, unlawful was being done, or if, there were some, any kind of like incidents, they would be, there to respond. So the awareness of the Black Panthers beyond Oakland, how the Black Panthers kind of spread beyond Oakland, starts in May of 1967. So national and even global awareness of the Panthers grows after basically a protest at the California state capitol in Sacramento. And what was happening was basically the Panthers were out there in the streets of Oakland doing this stuff, and the California State Assembly decided they were going to try to pass some gun control. Um, they didn't they didn't want, the police departments and stuff were afraid, and so then there's this rush to become, pro gun control in California. So the State Assembly Committee on Criminal Procedure was scheduled to discuss what was known as the Mulford Act, which would have made the public carrying of loaded firearms illegal. The governor at that time in California, of course, was Ronald Reagan, and so the Republican Party was behind a lot of this to try to basically um, get the guns out of the hands of the Black Panthers in particular. So what the Panthers did is they sent a group of 26 of them armed, led by Bobby Seale, traveling from Oakland to Sacramento to protest the bill. And then the group entered the assembly carrying their weapons, which prompted the police to arrest Bobby Seale and some of the other Panthers. They had to, they quickly escorted Ronald Reagan out of the Capitol, and it became this huge, like, kind of news event, as you see in the newspaper headline from the following day, with this imagery of, these Black guys in leather jackets and berets and sunglasses and these huge guns, and it just made for a huge kind of media spectacle. And as a result of that, the Black Panthers basically make kind of like international headlines, and this image spreads, not just around the United States, but around the world. And overnight, almost, there are Black Panther chapters and other people that are basically wanting to do the same thing. They, look at this image and are like, yeah, we should do that too. So the group really begins to begins to grow tremendously after 1967. Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, in the meantime, draw up a 10-point program to basically explain what the Black Panthers are all about and what their demands are and what they want. And you look at this 10-point program and see that it emphasizes a lot of economic justice issues, not just things about the police and mass incarceration and things like that, but also around economic issues around housing, employment, healthcare, education. Those kinds of issues were the things that the Panthers were, increasingly going to emphasize, and to see, like, the police brutality as almost like symptomatic of these larger structural institutional inequalities. So the Panthers kind of, as the years went on, they kind of like revised and changed some of the wording in the 10-point program. But I believe that this is the like the more kind of original version of it that started appearing in their newspaper. They had like a weekly newspaper called the Black Panther, and in it in every issue, they would put this 10-point program or some variation of the 10-point program. Um, so by the end of 1968, the Panthers had established 38 chapters and branches around the United States, claiming something more than around 5,000 members. And as the group grew, so too did its ideology. The group's ideology had evolved to become something more like a revolutionary internationalist movement. So it had evolved long past its origins as a self-defense cop watch kind of group. Huey Newton called on the Panthers to, quote, serve the people and to make survival programs a priority within its branches. Serve the people was a slogan that had come from Mao Zedong in communist China. And so the most famous of their programs, of these serve the people programs, was the Free Breakfast for Children program, which was initially run out of a church in Oakland. And it was especially significant because it served as a space for educating young people about the current condition of the Black community and the actions that the party was taking to address that condition. So they would feed, hundreds of kids who, otherwise were, very frequently going to school hungry and, therefore at a disadvantage in their own education. But the Panthers, would also, wouldn't just feed them, but also would, put an emphasis on educating them and talking about the issues that were going on in the community and talking about the ways that the Panthers, were trying to address those conditions. So it was an educational as well as a service kind of event. And they, started doing this in Oakland, and eventually that model spread to other cities. And also other survival programs were what they called survival programs, were basically free services such as clothing distribution, classes on politics and economics, free medical clinics, lessons on self-defense and first aid, transportation to upstate prisons for family members of inmates, emergency response ambulance program, a drug and alcohol rehabilitation, testing for sickle cell disease. So the Panthers are doing all these things that, like the government isn't doing to try to address the problems in the community, a whole wide range of social programs. And so this was, the way that the Panthers saw that, that they could become a revolutionary organization, was not just, with guns, but with like this emphasis on serving the people and helping people in their community survive. Um, so, but as the Panthers start to grow, in the late 1960s, there's this huge repressive response on the part of the United States government and all sorts of various local police departments, especially starting after the inauguration of President Richard Nixon, he's elected in November 1968 and comes into office in January of 1969, and basically immediately escalates a war on the Black Panther Party and a number of other left-wing social movements, particularly the anti-war movement, the movement people that were protesting the Vietnam War. So leaders of the Black Panther Party become targeted as part of this program called COINTELPRO, COINTELPRO is a kind of an abbreviation of a counterintelligence program that was launched by the FBI. And as a result of this program, many of the leaders of the Black Panthers were in one way or another neutralized. Either they were assassinated, or they were imprisoned, or they were in one way or another publicly humiliated, or falsely charged with crimes. There was all sorts of things that the FBI agents who worked for COINTELPRO sought to do as a way to try to, either completely take out a Black Panther leader, or to kind of, marginalize them, or, sully their reputation, or, in one way or another, kind of neutralize them, as they said. So the FBI's aims with COINTELPRO were to exercise surveillance, to infiltrate, to discredit, and to disrupt a wide range of leftist American political organizations and social movements. So this included, as I said, not just the Black Panther Party, but the anti-war movement, also the American Indian movement that had started in the late 1960s and continued through the early 70s, and the women's liberation groups that also had started in the late 1960s. All of these were movements, all of these social movements were seen as a threat by the US government, and by the FBI in particular, and by police departments across America. Okay, so the most famous of the results of this COINTEL program are seen in this book on the left-hand side about the assassination of Fred Hampton and another Black Panther named Mark Clark in the city of Chicago in December of 1969. Hampton was a prominent leader on the FBI's watch list, and they basically, like in working with the Chicago police and a tactical unit from the state of Illinois, they basically drugged him and then came into his apartment in the middle of the night and shot and killed him in his bed. And as well as Mark Clark. And, basically they went in and just shot up the entire apartment, as it says here, fired more than 100 gunshots throughout the apartment. And so, along with Fred Hampton, Mark Clark and several others were killed. Hampton was basically singled out because he was, by all accounts, an incredibly talented leader, an incredibly charismatic speaker, somebody who was very young. He was, 21 years old at the time, and had an extraordinary ability to appeal to other young people in Chicago, not just in the Black community, but they were putting together a multiracial coalition, basically the first, like, kind of rainbow coalition, as they called it, that included Black kids from Chicago, but also Puerto Rican kids, and also, like, working class white people, from Appalachia, and other people who had moved to Chicago from with more kind of like poor rural um, backgrounds. And so Fred Hampton was this very kind of charismatic figure, and it's been proven that Chicago police and the FBI and the Illinois state of Illinois attorney's office, that all these forces saw him as a threat, and they very intentionally carried out this execution. So with COINTELPRO, there's basically a kind of an extinguishing of the Black Panthers, as it, as by the early 1970s, basically. The Panthers had been, so many people had been jailed and put up on charges and you know killed or in some way or another neutralized. Um, we're kind of turning here now towards thinking more contemporaneously about Black Lives Matter as a social movement. And so, how we will describe Black Lives Matter is as a movement of loosely affiliated and locally organized groups rather than some centralized organization. So, this is important to, just to emphasize that there is like a national Black Lives Matter organization, but really when we talk about Black Lives Matter as a social movement, it's a very decentralized kind of like local affiliations that have some like a loose kind of connection, but really are more kind of like locally decentralized. It really depends on what's going on in your particular community. The larger social context for this movement, it has to do again with police violence and with the larger forces that we talked about in the lecture on the new Jim Crow. That is to say, mass incarceration, racial bias in the criminal justice system, the militarization of the police, all of these trends that we've seen, that especially accelerated during the 1980s with the war on drugs. And so all of those forces that have been building, since the 1980s, really kind of come home to roost in the protest of Black Lives Matter. Also, systemic issues and institutionalized racism in the spheres of housing, education, healthcare, employment, all of these things that were also important for the Black Panthers and the forms of institutionalized inequality that we've looked at the entire semester in one way or another. And also another important feature of Black Lives Matter is its reckoning with history. It's reckoning with legacies of racism that are embodied in statues and monuments and other markers of history. Black Lives Matter, in a lot of ways, has been this kind of it has called attention to a larger reckoning with American history and with the roots of slavery, racism, and settler colonialism. So when we talk about Black Lives Matter, at least as a kind of organization, we go back to the year 2013. These three Black women, Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi, basically formed the sort of the Black Lives Matter network that is the sort of overarching national organization. Garza, who's an activist from here in San Francisco, described the network as an online platform that existed to provide activists with a shared set of principles and goals. So again, the media part here is really important. As an online platform where obviously Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube and other social networks have played a very important role in the mobilization of this movement, in the same way that like past movements were also enabled by different forms of media, like how I talked about with the Black Panthers. So much of their initial growth was as a result of the media image that was spread through newspapers and television. So it's important when thinking about social movements generally, to think about how they deal with the media, and how their media imagery and media messaging is an important part of how movements mobilize and organize. So basically, as I mentioned, this is a pretty decentralized network. This social movement of Black Lives Matter. It's one where the local chapters are asked to commit to the organization's list of guiding principles, but otherwise they operate without a central structure or hierarchy. So as a movement, Black Lives Matter is grassroots and decentralized, and leaders have emphasized the importance of local organizing over national leadership. Of course, the event that the tragic event that basically initiated the formation of Black Lives Matter was the murder of Trayvon Martin and the acquittal of George Zimmerman, his killer. So the movement got its name with using a hashtag, on Twitter and I suppose on Facebook also, after the acquittal of Zimmerman. He had killed Trayvon Martin in February 2012 and was found not guilty in 2013, the summer of 2013. And it's his acquittal at trial that basically kicks off this movement. The circumstances around this killing are obviously very well known. Zimmerman had shot him and then had been released on the night of the murder. The police accepted his claim that he was simply acting in self-defense. And so he wasn't arrested or even charged with a crime for like 6 weeks. And then there was this kind of building public pressure as more and more people started to hear about the case. And only then was he even arrested. He then, when he was arrested, pled not guilty based on a law that's called Stand Your Ground that was passed in Florida in 2005. And the Stand Your Ground law basically permits the use of deadly force whenever someone feels like they are at risk of great bodily harm in a confrontation. And the Florida Stand Your Ground law basically extends what's called the no retreat doctrine to vehicles and public spaces. So it's basically, there's one provision of the law, it's called like the castle doctrine, which is like if somebody comes to is at your home and you feel threatened or at risk, then you have the right, I suppose, to shoot them or to exercise some other deadly force. But the Florida one goes even further and extends that to like if you're in your car or if you're in a public space, as George Zimmerman was that night. So this is actually, these Stand Your Ground laws are fairly commonplace in different American states, especially the ones that are more conservative and dominated by Republican legislatures. At the time of Martin's shooting, 22 other states had adopted a similar Stand Your Ground laws. These Stand Your Ground laws are actually written by this kind of conservative legislative body. I think they're called APAC, or no, they're called ALEC, ALEC. And they basically like write these laws that like are ready to be just like signed and implemented by Republican, legislators. Um, so stand your ground laws. That's why there are so many of them in various states across the country. Um, the event, so it's Trayvon Martin's murder and the acquittal of George Zimmerman that kind of kickstarts the formation of Black Lives Matter as an online platform. But the thing that really ignites it as a social movement is the Ferguson uprising in 2014, and this is of course captured in the documentary that I've assigned for you to accompany this part of the class. The name of the documentary is called "Whose Streets," and it basically looks at this uprising that takes place in a suburb of the city of St. Louis during the summer of 2014. And again, the incidents around this are very well known. It involves an 18-year-old African American named Michael Brown, who was shot and killed by a white police officer named Darren Wilson. And the especially egregious circumstances around this was that the local authorities left Brown's body in the street for 4.5 hours. And that was, as people came out of their homes to see this, that was seen as a demeaning and disrespectful act by the police, something akin to a public lynching. And so the uprising that followed this horrible murder and then this terrible action of just leaving this kid's body in the street for 4.5 hours. The uprising that follows that is what's documented in the film Whose Streets. As shown in Whose Streets, the day after Brown's killing, local police stations assembled approximately 150 officers in riot gear in response to a protest and candlelight vigil. Over the next week, police used smoke bombs, flash grenades, rubber bullets, and tear gas to disperse protests. So there's basically, the night of the killing or the day after, people, in Ferguson have assembled for a candlelight vigil. You see all of this in the documentary, and there's just this huge, like, militarized over response on the part of the police, where they just like this, they have almost like they're going to war, like with this, all of this equipment and stuff that is being used, and they, respond to a candlelight vigil as if it was a riot. And so that just kind of further escalates the situation. And again, this is like so much the culmination of the stuff that has been building for decades and decades, with like the new Jim Crow and the militarization of the police, and police departments getting these huge budgets to spend on all this weaponry. And now that it's like the police have the chance to kind of like bring out their new toys, and use them in this situation. So in response to that, the governor of Missouri, a guy named Jay Nixon, holds a press conference and declares a state of emergency and implements curfews that start in Ferguson from midnight to 5 a.m. On August 9th, 18th, after the violent clashes during the curfew, Governor Nixon issued an executive order calling in the National Guard to help restore peace and order and to protect the citizens of Ferguson, unquote. So the documentary goes into, gives you a kind of a firsthand, like you are there kind of account of these events, including, a lot of interviews with people who were involved. And it gives you, I think, a really good sense of what it was like to be there during this time. And I think it gives you also a range of different perspectives on what was going on. And, so this sort of thing escalates very quickly. Um, so the impact, though, of the Ferguson uprising is um, in the fall of 2014. Here we see Black Lives Matter beginning to like spread like a wildfire throughout the country. So as the images and the stories of the conflict start to spread through social media during that summer, and people are like live streaming, and there's all kinds of a real sense of like that you are there. Black Lives Matter begins to grow exponentially as a social movement across the whole country. In September 2014, Black Lives Matter organizes a freedom ride that brought more than 500 activists from across the US into Ferguson to support the work being done on the ground by local organizations. The name Freedom Ride is a callback to the protests that were done in 1961 to try to desegregate the bus system, and in the United States. And so like white and black activists would ride together to in these freedom rides to defy the local segregation ordinances. And in many cases, they were attacked by, violent racist mobs who would be waiting for them at the bus station. In October 2014, the movement organizes a 4-day event called the Weekend of Resistance, in which more than 100 protesters from 1,000 protesters from across the United States marched in downtown St. Louis. So just a sense here again that this movement is really beginning to grow and expand, and local chapters are starting to organize, and you have this kind of decentralized network of different groups that are sprouting up in cities all across the country. Another important impact of the Ferguson uprising is that it brings national attention to what was going on in Ferguson. And so it causes the US Justice Department to conduct a federal investigation. So these are the federal government basically goes in to look at this, what's been going on in the Ferguson Police Department. And they come out of it after their investigation with this scathing review, this report that's issued in March of 2015. And among its key findings were that in Ferguson, race had everything to do with who was stopped by the police and who they used force against. That police and municipal officials, the same people who are responsible for carrying out justice, had sent racist emails and not one person objected. Officers had abused their power and completely disregarded the law. And the FPD culture and supervisors supported them in doing so. And finally, the municipal court was out to make money for the city, and its decisions were motivated by this goal versus public safety. So this last part, is important because the documentary also shows you like how, like so many people in this Ferguson community had been impacted by these policing practices And one of them is like basically that the police are out, ticketing people, like they have a certain kind of financial quota, to ticket people, and like for jaywalking or for having a busted tail light or all kinds of like minor incidents. And that's actually how Mike Brown ended up getting shot, is that police initially stopped him for jaywalking. So these kinds of like petty crimes, but they have there's this financial incentive behind them, because the municipal courts and the municipal governments are basically trying to make money for the city. And people end up getting caught in a cycle of debt, where they can't pay their tickets, and so then they are back in the system, and they have to spend time in jail, and this is this whole kind of system. And so the report exposes a lot of this in Ferguson, but kind of the implication is that this is not just a Ferguson problem. That this is the problem that is widespread in various municipalities across the United States. This is beginning to kind of uncover a very systematic and widespread abusive practices that are not just in the Ferguson Police Department, but in many others. Another impact of the Ferguson uprising is that the Washington Post news organization starts to compile a database about police shootings. This is not information that the police voluntarily give up to news agencies. They don't tabulate how many people they kill or what race they are or anything like that. But in response to the Ferguson uprising, the Washington Post starts to compile these numbers starting in 2015. So this is like the first time that we really have any kind of reliable data on police violence. And so the Post basically creates this database that catalogs every fatal shooting nationwide by a police officer in the line of duty. And the Post's reporting has documented persistent racial disparities in police shootings, right? So something that we all kind of knew, but we didn't have like the exact data or the exact numbers to sort of prove. And so among their findings are that Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by the police than white people, and 30% of Black victims were unarmed compared to 19% of white victims. So Black victims are more likely unarmed than white ones. So this, gets into again the kind of the perceptions. You remember when we talked about education and about the criminalization of Black girls in public schools, and we talked about like how there is this, sometimes conscious but sometimes unconscious bias about who's a threat and how dangerous they are, and these kinds of internalized biases and prejudices that often translate into lethal violence. So among the other findings from this department, from the Washington Post's database, basically that like the number of people killed annually by the police has been pretty consistently around 1,000. That the police basically kill 1,000 people a year, about 3 people a day. And that number has been uh, pretty consistent since the New York Post, the Washington Post started compiling these numbers in 2015. Also, findings include that although half of the people shot and killed by the police are white, Black Americans and Hispanic Americans are killed by a police at a disproportionate rate, right? So, like, half of people shot and killed by the police are white, but more than half of the Americans in general are white. So, hence the disproportionate uh, um, killings of Black and Latino peoples. An overwhelming majority of the people shot and killed by the police are male, over 95%, and more than half the victims are between 20 and 40 years old. So overwhelmingly, we're talking about young men who are in the crosshairs of police violence. Obviously, not all, but much more disproportionately. And again, that kind of points us back to this question of perception and who is seen as a threat, and who is seen as you know potentially violent or something of that matter. Police shootings have taken place in every state and have occurred more frequently in cities where populations are concentrated. The states with the highest rates of shootings are New Mexico, Alaska, and Oklahoma, which I found interesting and somewhat surprising. So, to go back to Black Lives Matter as a movement, it really begins to grow and spread, as we've seen in the previous slides, between 2014 and 2016. It continues to grow, typically in response to viral videos of police violence and shootings of Black people. In the summer of 2014, there's also this viral video of Eric Garner's death by chokehold by the New York City police officer who killed him in a chokehold. There's also the viral video of 12-year-old Tamir Rice's shooting in Cleveland. These things sparked major protests across the U.S. And against police violence. In December of 2014, Black Lives Matter protests grew from New York City's department stores to the Mall of America in Minneapolis to Oakland, where activists shut down the BART train on Black Friday. I remember being part of these protests. I was living in New York at the time, and we would often march into department stores or Grand Central Station or other public places, and it was often very quite intense. We would have die-ins where we laid in the middle of the street, and these actions, and sometimes people were people were watching, were supportive, and sometimes they were really not. And it made for an especially intense holiday season, because you want people to not get lost in this haze of consumerism. You want to remind them of what's going on, while they're shopping or while they're in public spaces. And so this was a pretty intense and I believe a pretty effective way of confronting people with the issue so that they couldn't ignore it. The largest among these uprisings, certainly the most destructive of these uprisings, takes place in the city of Baltimore in the spring of 2015 in response to another infamous police killing that whose video also went viral of a 25-year-old guy named Freddie Gray, whose neck and spine were basically severed during what the police call a rough ride in the back of a police vehicle, and then went into a coma and eventually died. In response to this, which again, some of which is captured on video, in response to this, there is this huge uprising in the city of Baltimore, in which 285 businesses are damaged. There are 150 vehicle fires, 60 structure fires, 27 drugstores looted. Some 250 people were arrested, and at least 20 police injured. So here we see, as I think is depicted here in this picture, in the slide, here we see a really intense, uprising in response to this act of police violence. And again, as with Ferguson, what the governor and basically decide to do is to call in the National Guard. So it takes thousands of police and National Guard troops to be deployed, and a state of emergency to be called for this uprising to be eventually put down. So again, I think this shows a lot of the depths of frustration, the sense of desperation, like that as Martin Luther King had said, a riot is the voice of the unheard. So Black Lives Matter, in 2015, this Time magazine cover is interesting because they've originally written 1968 and then crossed it out with 2015, and that is because these uprisings that were seen in various cities across the country were like nothing America had seen since 1968. 1968 was a year of widespread urban riots and rebellions, especially after Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. On that night of April 4th, there are, widespread rebellions in almost every city across the country. So, the same kinds of things that we've seen more recently, rioting, looting, property destruction, and huge deployments of police and National Guard in response. So there's this echo of history, but one that people hadn't seen in like almost 50 years. So by 2015, Black Lives Matter has evolved from a protest slogan or a cry into a social movement and a political force. Black Lives Matter groups had succeeded in winning landmark prosecutions, of removing police chiefs from their jobs, of activating social protest on college campuses. So, for example, at the University of Missouri, there's a hunger strike initiated a boycott by the football team, and that drove the university president out of office. So an uprising had developed into organized groups with specific demands. Activists were organizing national conferences now so that local groups could connect and swap strategies. So there's this effort basically to kind of more coordinate what are otherwise these like kind of decentralized, locally organized groups and chapters. And so there's this emphasis now on bringing people together to try to, trade strategies and organizing ideas. And there's a real kind of confluence happen. It's really happening now as a social movement, not just a thing that's like online, that people are connected through the internet, but now a thing where people are more and more connecting like face to face. In response to police brutality, Black Lives Matter activists also focused on systemic issues related to housing, employment, education, and healthcare. So, for example, in the Bay Area, uh, BLM has been part of the Fight for 15, the campaign to hike the minimum wage to $15 an hour. That Fight for 15 has been especially important in like the fast food industry. Um, so there's an attempt here now for the emphasis not only to be on police violence and these issues around like mass incarceration and the new Jim Crow, but there's also now these attempts to kind of go to the roots of social inequalities that are prevalent in housing, employment, education, and healthcare. So again, there's a kind of an analogous, thing to like how the Black Panthers had, evolved in their organizing from, starting with the police, but then realizing that the police is really just kind of the tip of the spear, and that you have to also get to the root of these larger socioeconomic inequalities. And so, the social movement has to be able to, in some way, address and serve communities. Um, at this time, too, Black Lives Matter is becoming part of like the national popular culture, particularly in sports and music. Right. So this is also an important dimension of social movements, is that they not only have to, try to change policy and institutions, but they also have to embed themselves in the culture and really, kind of change people's consciousness and, to establish a presence in things like, sports and music. So we saw that here in San Francisco in December of 2015. A young Black man named Mario Woods was shot and killed by police officers in the Bayview neighborhood. Video of the shooting here went viral. The DA had refused to charge officers with a crime, as almost always happens. And so the thing was that the Super Bowl was going to be held here in the Bay Area in Santa Clara in the 49ers stadium in January of 2016. And so protesters kind of took advantage of the fact that the media spotlight was on, the Bay Area, and sort of tried to redirect that spotlight on the Super Bowl to call attention to the killing of Mario Woods. So there were, a lot of demonstrations and rallies and civil disobedience and things that got, a lot of attention, given the fact that, the Bay Area was in the spotlight as a result of the Super Bowl being here. And this is also the Super Bowl where at the halftime show, Beyonce gave what turned out to be a very controversial performance of Lemonade that appeared to pay tribute to the Black Panthers and to criticize police violence. And as you see here in the picture from that event, these are some of Beyonce's dancers who, again, like the beret and the leather, the whole kind of style was indeed meant to pay homage to the Black Panther Party. And you see here one of the dancers is holding a sign that says "Justice for Mario Woods," and then of course like also the raised fist, the very kind of iconic tribute to the Panthers that Beyonce did in the in the heat of this moment, and in a place also where this was really heated because of what had happened to Mario Woods. Um, so again, Black Lives Matter protests and actions are continuing throughout 2016 to develop. There are again many viral videos from Baton Rouge or Philando Castile in St. Paul that summer of 2016. Um, on July 8th, more than 100 people are arrested on a day of protests. And so more and more people are committing acts of civil disobedience and kind of raising the stakes, escalating things as we go into the summer of 2016. And then, of course, the other, kind of event that's informing a lot of the background is the presidential election that is being built up towards in 2016, and Donald Trump holding these rallies, escalating with his his like racist rhetoric about immigration and about terrorists and about black sports figures like Colin Kaepernick, all of these ways in which basically Trump is becoming more popular by throwing red meat to people who are scared and angry about what they're seeing across the country. And so there's the event is the atmosphere is becoming more and more like a pressure cooker in that summer of 2016. At this time, also, in sports and popular culture, again, we see the NBA stars like LeBron James and Carmelo Anthony, Chris Paul, Dwayne Wade. They opened the ESPY Awards with a Black Lives Matter message. Players would take the court with various things, written on them in support of Black lives. Or come out of the, tunnel with their hands up. Just all kinds of ways in which there's a symbolic recognition of what the movement is saying. And that escalates even further when Colin Kaepernick and another player on the 49ers start taking a knee during the national anthem in August of 2016. And when Kaepernick is asked about this, he says, "I'm not going to stand up to show pride in a flag for a country that oppresses Black people and people of color. To me, this is bigger than football, and it would be selfish on my part to look the other way. There are bodies in the street and people getting paid leave and getting away with murder." It's so now this is again a thing that America really hadn't seen since the 1960s, of the way that this social movement has now kind of made its inroads into professional sports. That was something that had happened in the 1960s with Muhammad Ali, also with the protests at the Olympics, and with various other athletes, but hadn't really after like the 1970s, you hadn't really seen a whole lot of that kind of like protest within the realm of sports. And so for Kaepernick, and Eric Reed and other players to start taking this stance, especially when we're talking about something like NFL football, where most of the audience is more conservative. This again, like, kind of ignites this movement and this whole kind of situation. The next couple of years are seeing this growing connection where Black Lives Matter and other social movements are connecting in their common opposition to white nationalism and the presidency of Donald Trump. So you see like the protests at the airports over immigration issues, and then in the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, that also brings together different activist groups against, white supremacy. And so then there's this kind of epic battle that takes place in Charlottesville in August of 2017. This picture is one of many, but perhaps the most epic of all of um, the many images that came out of that day. That day, of course, ended very tragically with a white supremacist plowing his car through a group of demonstrators. It killed a woman named Heather Heyer. So this was like, again, we'd have to have a whole other lecture on the right wing social movements and white nationalist social movements. But this was a kind of an epic collision between these opposing forces, who are on different sides of this, long-standing issue of racism in America. And so Charlottesville was really a kind of a culminating event of what had been building for quite some time. We're also in this time, beginning to see again the ways that Black Lives Matter is making an impact, not just in people's awareness of the police, but a growing kind of cultural impact, that's demonstrated by things like the annual Black Lives Matter art exhibition that has been taking place in Richmond, Virginia, starting in 2017. But then the biggest wave of protest and uprising that that we've ever seen in by some indicators is in the summer of 2020, in response to the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And this sets off what by depending on how you measure it is really like the largest wave of protest ever seen in American history, and in some sense, around the world too. So, of course, the events of this are very well known. Derek Chauvin, a Minneapolis police officer, knelt on Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, while 3 other police officers looked on and prevented passersby from intervening. Again, all of this was captured on video that then went pretty immediately viral in the context of the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic. So everybody was extremely online at that point, I think, and so I think that contributed to the video getting as much circulation as it did. The protests quickly spread. There were, of course, like the media protests in the Minneapolis, St. Paul area, but those quickly spread to over 2,000 cities and towns in more than 60 countries. So again, there's a kind of like an international response to this, in a way that like had not been seen before. The polls in the summer of 2020 estimated that between 15 million and 26 million people had participated at some point in the demonstrations in the United States, making these protests the largest in US history. That's just a staggering number, 15 to 26 million people. So that very staggering number really gives you a sense of like how this movement had spread, and was now, something that even in like, little towns and suburbs and places where you might not necessarily expect it, they're starting to hold, Black Lives Matter demonstrations or rallies or events, in not just in like the big cities, but in places where ordinarily you hadn't seen that sort of thing. The protests peaked on June 6th when something like 500,000 people turned out in nearly 550 places across the United States. Here's a map of where those protests took place, or at least the major ones. As the protests spread nationwide, at least 200 cities in the US imposed curfews by early June 2020, while more than 30 states and Washington, D.C. activated more than 96,000 National Guard, State Guard, 82nd Airborne, and the 3rd Infantry Regiment service members. Again, it's almost like America's at, in a kind of condition of civil war at that point. Because you're calling in these massive amounts of troops in order to put down these urban uprisings that are spreading across the country. The deployment of all of these troops, when combined with pre-existing deployments related to the COVID-19 pandemic and other natural disasters, constituted the largest military operation other than war in US history. So the largest military operation other than war in US history. By the end of June of 2020, at least 14,000 people had been arrested. Currently, outside the US, so beyond the United States, the protests occurred in more than 60 countries on every continent. So this is, a sort of a mass uprising, the likes of which had never been seen before, and which was not just an American thing, but became global. There's been a lot said and written and assumed about the violence and damage and destruction of these protests. So I thought it was important to try to get some of the data right about this and sort of try to clarify things. So one report estimated that between in this summer, between May 26th and August 22nd, 93% of individual protests were peaceful and non-destructive. Another estimated that by the end of June, 96.3% of 7,305 demonstrations involved no injuries and no property damage. So those findings basically show to you that like the vast majority of these protests were peaceful, non-destructive, nobody got hurt, there's no property damage. But there was, in fact, in a minority of cases, there was significant arson, vandalism, and looting And especially in this period between May 26th and June 8th, so like the first week and a half or 2 weeks of the protests, that those actions caused approximately between $1 and $2 billion in damages nationally, and that constitutes the highest recorded damage from civil disorder in U.S. history, surpassing what had previously been the record set during the 1992 Los Angeles riots. So again, this gives you a sense of like the scale and the scope of this uprising. Again, the likes of which this country had never seen before. So the questions for Black Lives Matter going forward as a social movement. This picture is just absolutely incredible. On the one hand, the like the sort of the poise and the unshaken courage of this woman, juxtaposed with these cartoonishly over militarized police. Just absolutely ridiculous how much body wear and and weaponry and just all this stuff that they've got on. It really tells you, one of these things where like a picture is worth 1,000 words. So the questions, moving forward, as I have entirely confident that this social movement will continue to grow and be an important force and dynamic in American society. The questions, that we have to this point about, are like, how has this movement succeeded in changing the conversation about racism and policing? What alternatives to policing can be imagined? So a lot of this question was discussed around the idea of defunding the police, or bringing in alternatives to policing when people are having a mental health crisis, or there's a domestic dispute, or somebody's homeless, or those kinds of situations that the police don't really want to deal with either. And just like there can be a more effective means of uh, dealing with these social problems, these various social problems, and that we ought to be funding those kinds of alternatives instead of increasingly sinking more and more money into this kind of militarized response that we get from police departments. And then there's the big, other question of, how can this issue of police brutality connect with these larger systemic issues that, we've mentioned throughout the lecture, in connection with the Black Panthers too. These issues of institutionalized discrimination in housing, healthcare, employment, and education. So, ultimately, as I've mentioned, like the police violence issue, has to be seen as kind of like the tip of the spear, and within that, or underlying that, are these larger institutional systemic inequalities that have to be addressed in order for these issues of justice to really flower and flourish. Okay, so that concludes things, and I wish you a good day. Bye.